Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you everyone who's come this evening. A special thank you to Pinewoods Camp and their board of directors. We're very excited to be here with you tonight. So I'll let Jonathan begin with introducing himself, and then I will follow.
Cha Waninakan Natasu is Jonathan James Perry, Nutoma Sakpanahanat. Hello, my name is Jonathan James Perry, and I come from the Aquinnah community of the Wampanoag Nation located on Nauk Bay, what is now referred to, it's kind of a nickname, Martha's Vineyard.
Ta Wanina Khan, Natasuislia, Wananina Hanagansik, Natomas Aquidnesan, Natai Nus Kwisidat. Hello, everyone. My name is Leah. I'm a citizen of the Narragansett Indian tribe in Rhode Island. And I'm very happy to be joining you tonight. And we are both here visiting with you from Mashantucket Pequot Homelands in Connecticut. We're on travel and we appreciate the patience that you've given us. We've had a little bit of tech help. We're actually staying in a hotel. So thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. A lot of the times when we begin a program, we like to really think carefully and deeply about where we are and the ancestors of that land and that place. Most oftentimes, we're presenting from our own homelands or my homelands. And when we do that, we really like to just give thanks and call attention to the people that we're presenting to be mindful of the homelands that they may be on and who they belong to, and the Indigenous people who may be from there ancestrally and who may be living there today, and also the beings that are there in creation, the waterways. And this is part of what we're talking about this evening. We are talking about Indigenous relationships with the land. We're talking about land acknowledgements and what that means and what that looks like for various organizations and some of the work that we've done. And we're happy to share all of this with you. And we're also happy to answer questions that you may have. So towards the end of the program, we'll open it up for questions. But we are going to begin. We have two slideshows that we'll be sharing with you today about the two different topics. So bear with me while I pull up the first one. Okay.
So living with the land, the concept of living with the land, really living within the land, is central to our societies and central to our way of expressing ourselves, looking at things around us, and the reciprocal relationship that we maintain between ourselves and all of what we consider creation. So all of creation is quite literally that. It is every animal, insect, every tree, every blade of grass, all the medicine plants, the berry plants, it's the water, it's the air, it's absolutely everything, including your cousin or your family member or yourself, your impact to that place of creation. And so it is very central to our core teachings in our society and in Indigenous societies in general, typically, that you live within a balanced system, that you pay into that system in a way that you give and gift and respect that system, and that you do not endlessly take from that system, because you throw that place, that home, out of balance. And it's very important to always try to seek that perfect balance, to let's say if you're cutting materials, that you're encouraging seeds to grow, and that you're planting trees or you're planting plants to replace them. That simple teachings like when you go to harvest certain types of food items, let's say the strawberries, the watahemniash, the heartberries are ripe, and it's time to go harvest them in June, around the time of our strawberry Thanksgiving celebrations and our acknowledgement, our songs, our dances, and our celebrations for that gift of creation and that nurturing berry that is so enjoyable. It's the first berry of the year, so it's celebrated and exciting, and we look forward to it every single year, the coming of those berries, and to have the discipline and the respect for those berries that when you travel out to harvest them, you go to the berry fields, you go to the areas you've encouraged those berries to grow, and you don't necessarily take those first berries that you see, that maybe you go further. You want to encourage them to spread and grow, and you want to make sure that the beings around that also look forward to the strawberries, that they have an equal opportunity to get them. I know everyone has been frustrated at one point or another when you're harvesting berries and you see the sweetest end of the strawberry nibbled away, and you're like, oh, those chipmunks, they got here first, but those chipmunks require those berries just like we do. They celebrate them and they get excited and they go and check those plants every day till that berry is just perfect, and they get there just an hour before you do, and they take a bite. But you have to acknowledge them and recognize that they have that right, that they need that sustenance too. And so understanding that we are not the only thing that matters in creation, but that we are just one of the beings of creation, and that we fulfill a role and a responsibility to creation. So that is part of the concept that is just so rooted in our teachings, in our approach to things, and what creates the humble approach that we try to maintain and that we instill in our future generations and our young people, so that when they go out into the field to do things like harvest for what you see in the background of this photograph here, our traditional wigdu, our traditional home, that they do it in a respectful manner. Here's a picture of a project that I worked on all of last year. This is the framework of a longhouse, a large style of home with multiple fireplaces in it. And this is the beginning of the structure of a traditional house. And you can see, not only is it important to be meticulous and careful and go out and harvest what we use, the white cedar trees for the framework, but that we handle that material carefully. And that material, those beings, they provide us with an endless amount of resources, and you just have to know how to process them. You have to listen to your elders when they teach you how to do things. So what we actually do, and what you see in this picture here, is you see me tying off with the bark of the cedar tree. So not only are we able to harvest the trees to make the frame of our home, but then the bark of the tree is processed, and that inner bark is the rope, and it's as strong as any rope that you can make. And that's what we tie the home together with. And luckily, I have my son to help me. And so he's standing on the frame. That's what he did mostly, was stand in the frame, sometimes run off with what I needed. But he is growing up with that same level of knowledge. And I thought it was actually a very beautiful thing. The other day, there was an advertisement on TV about tree cutting service. And my son basically stated that the people weren't doing it right because they weren't offering tobacco first. They were just cutting trees and killing them. And so he's 5 years old, and he gets the concept of giving offerings and being respectful and thinking of that tree as a life, and thinking of that tree as a life that far outlasts our own life. He knows that trees will grow and become large, and they will be here long after we're not here. He understands their their long life and what they do for our people to provide us what we need, and provide other things as well, with homes and shelter and air and all the things that these beautiful beings in creation give us. This is a slide of a show that we actually love and my son loves. It's Molly of Denali, and it's an Alaskan Native family, sat in a Native community, and they have all sorts of dealings, and it's really nice because not only does my son enjoy it, but we enjoy it too, because we're actually seeing cartoons and shows now that are reflective of our society, and they're reflective of what we look like and how we function, and even some of the jokes or some of the struggles that we have in our communities, some of the access issues, some of the environmental issues are talked about in this system. And those are very central to who we are as a people today, what we're dealing with today.
So I created this meme last year off of Molly of Denali because it was really, really wonderful to see Jonathan work with tribal members of a specific community and teaching them how to build a longhouse. There are very few master longhouse builders, and there are very few people in all of our collective New England communities who have this skill and knowledge body, or who have participated in it. And so it really is, building a longhouse is an act of cultural renaissance that we're really entering into. And we're able to enter into this, I think, especially in these past few years, because of inclusion and because of different initiatives from different ally groups helping to support some of this work and seeing the need for it. And so over here on the right, we have the ancestors represented by a character on the show, Grandpa Nat. And so just as we do these different traditional skills, such as building a longhouse or participating in ceremony or dancing or singing or eating our traditional foods and growing our traditional seeds, we feel this love from our ancestors and this pride that they really have, that we have been able to continue on with a lot of this. So I like putting this in our presentations because it really does mean a lot to us. And of course, it's great to see our son being reflected in modern media today, which we never had as children.
The difficulty that we deal with today, and our ancestors talked about this, and it was actually some of what pressured Native people to fight to try to regain control or to slow the expanse of colonial or early American incursion into tribal lands and the unfortunate clear cutting and taking of resources or the beings of creation around us. This is a slide that represents a traditional house that I worked on in 2009, 2010. And it took a number of days to harvest the trees and to bring them back to my community in Aquinnah, and to start working with tribal members for this build, for this traditional house, which came out to be, a beautiful home. It lasted many years. This is the environment that you typically would see. You can see, the waterway, and then you can see beyond it is some of the swampland, and you can see the Atlantic cedars growing in stands there. But they're becoming impacted. Waterways are being impacted, and it's affecting that environment. You can see a space here. I'm walking by a fence, and there's a lot of what we would consider usable material, including medicine plants and trees and cedars beyond that fence, but I have no access. I have no way to get to them. They're protected, but really they're not protected. human interaction in these spaces goes back to the time of the glaciers, when these forests and these swamps and these plants started to form after the glacial retreat thousands and thousands of years ago. The environment that people enjoy today and the spaces, the plant distribution and the tree distribution and the varying types of forest land that you see today, a lot of that was carefully groomed and carefully encouraged and maintained by native societies for those thousands of years. It's not that they were untouched, pristine forests. They were essentially forest gardens that Indigenous people played a key role in creating and protecting and encouraging. And so by actually limiting access and by isolating it, there are two things that occur. One, Indigenous people and other people now who live on these lands and would be normally stewards of the land and take on those roles and responsibilities for space are actually discouraged from having a relationship whatsoever. So they're not fulfilling that role. They're not opening up spaces. They're not doing controlled burns. They're not harvesting and keeping a healthy, productive forest with a wide distribution of ideal circumstances for a wide variety of animals and insects and various species, as well as the opportunity for certain types of plants or trees to propagate. So this is actually, those fences and those restrictions can be more harmful than good, provided the education, the teachings are there. And so in 2021, so we're talking about 11, 12 years later, it took me 31 days to harvest the same number of poles of cedar trees in a now more decimated environment and a more guarded and protected environment at the same time, where I went to conservation lands where they were restricting access by anyone, including tribal members, to the cedar swamps because the cedar swamps were dwindling. And I asked, but are you harvesting and opening up spaces for the saplings to grow? And is there interaction there? Or is it becoming stagnant and essentially dying because it's just choking and there's not really that activity, even to discourage the deer from browsing the young cedar saplings so they can't grow in the first place. So there's the problem is that by restricting access, even the animal populations go out of balance and they can be destructive as well to these spaces. Because normally in the winter, when you're hunting deer, you're going to go to the cedar forests because that's where the deer browse the cedar and they try to congregate in those spaces. So now they're able to do that unchecked and damage the cedar populations because they're not being driven out and dispersed again. And on top of that, there's no wolves in the Northeast really as they would have been. So that's another effect. But here's an example of, going through and select cutting and thinning out some of the saplings so other saplings have more light. There's more light coming down to the forest floor so that young saplings have an opportunity to grow up. So you always have, you have old trees and like these younger adult trees, and then you have these big saplings that are around 20, 30 years old, and then you have 20-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and then you have the baby cedars growing in an area where it's just constantly being visited and cared for, and the seed is being encouraged. And with that encouragement, there's opportunity for maintaining and teaching the communities, the younger generations, and keeping the culture going. So it's really the environment and its health has a direct effect on our ability to maintain our societies, our traditions, and our practices. And here, is my son helping again. He'll grow up rich with the culture, provided we have access to land and we're able to participate in that healthy relationship. into the future. This is an example of what we do today to try to make sense of this modern system, where my ancestors would have gone out and collected bark from a few old growth trees to cover a traditional house. Now we go to places where there's a lot of cutting happening, and we try to save some of the material from it to cover our houses. So we're doing kind of two things, where we're harvesting off of things that are already being cut and removed from the land, excuse me. And so, we're not encouraging more cutting and depleting the forest land, and we're also able to ultimately get a better use than mulch or compost, which is what is typical.
Or biomass.
Or biomass, exactly. Yeah. Another thing. So, here's an example of a sheet of bark harvested from some of the trees that we traditionally harvested from. And it takes multiple people to move these sheets of bark. It's quite an effort. Those sheets of bark will weigh 200 pounds, sometimes as much as 300 pounds a sheet, because they're like 6 feet by 6 feet or more at times. And then they go into the house in layers. And that's the finished product. That's what it looks like as a completed home. We do a house. And really, honestly, I show you these slides and I talk about this because the gardens and our traditional plants, the materials to build these homes, the beings of the forest and around us, the beings of the water, we have that relationship. We rely on them. We all do. Even today, all of our meals come from the earth in some fashion, some way. Our knowledge comes from the earth in a lot of ways. We're cared for daily, even to the point of grass cushioning our feet and the plants giving us oxygen and the trees shading us so that we don't burn in the sun. We have that relationship, whether we are aware of it and teaching our family members to be aware of it, or whether we're kind of blind to it and just assuming that that's our right, which obviously it's easy to forget and lose your way and lose everything by assuming that you just have a right to it without thought.
So we chose to just focus in specifically on this one aspect of traditional culture this time, because we can stand here and talk to you for days and days and days and days on end about the various different traditions and the various connections to the land and waters, all throughout our collective culture, our language, our language and our culture are intertwined, and built within our language are cultural concepts that cannot be translated properly into English or into any other language. And so we chose, I think, specifically to focus really in on Witu building because these are our homes. And of course, we don't live in them today, but they are absolutely crucial for the maintenance of, absolutely crucial for the maintenance of our traditions. These are the places where stories are told. These are the places where coming of age ceremonies happen, or wedding ceremonies, or sometimes funerary rites and ceremonies happen. And so without these homes and without these structures, there is a gap. There are places where they cannot happen. And so running the risk of not building these structures, we're running the risk of further endangering our traditions. And as Jonathan was speaking before, our connection to the land in this way, with respect to the cedar trees especially, and cedar being a very sacred medicine, a very sacred tree. And we're not just going and cutting these willy-nilly for fence posts, much like many people's ancestors did in the 17 and 1800s, or 16, 17 and 1800s. these are carefully selected and carefully harvested so that we can build structures that are ceremonial in nature. And we are very mindful when we go out. We're very mindful of the lives that we're taking and the beings that we may be disturbing in doing this, but we're also very mindful of selectively cutting in certain areas where it may help the environment, or we avoid it if it may prove a detriment. And so we are in some conversations with different agencies, but it definitely proved a struggle, especially this year with the environment changing, but the majority of public lands becoming private property. And so going from 5 calendar days to harvest lodge poles or Wetu poles to 31 calendar days just to scout and cut a few is very telling about what's happening. And so you might be wondering where this is going to lead into with respect to land acknowledgements, because when we talk about land acknowledgements, or when people think about land acknowledgements, they are typically thinking of statements that are said before a program. They're very in vogue right now. I think they're very popular, especially in nonprofits and higher education and in different systems and organizations where it feels good to have a land acknowledgement. But at the end of the day, what does a land acknowledgement truly mean? What is it about? What are the actions behind it? Because you can go forward and you can create and make a land acknowledgement, but what are you going to do to continue the Indigenous people's connection to the land? How are you going to be an ally in that when we are struggling? So I'm going to actually stop sharing the screen and segue right over into our other presentation here regarding land acknowledgements and what they are really about from an Indigenous perspective. So we recognize that land acknowledgements typically are formal or written statements, and they recognize and respect Indigenous people as stewards of the land and enduring relationships to the land. And that's all well and great. But what is the purpose of a land acknowledgement? And so this is typically an act of consolation that recognizes and calls attention to the Indigenous people of a particular homeland. Maybe you're in Boston, or maybe you're in Tucson, or maybe you're in where was I going with this? I almost said Athens, Georgia. Maybe anywhere, honestly, anywhere that you are walking on Turtle Islands in North America, you are on Indigenous lands, and people have been born, they grew up, they got married, they gave birth, they raised their children, they died, and they were buried back into that land for over 20,000 years. There's no single place on this continent where you can step that an Indigenous person has not stepped, where hundreds or thousands of Indigenous people have not stepped before. And so we need to recognize in building land acknowledgements, it's not just talking about the people who were there, but it's talking about the people who are there. It's talking about the relationship that Indigenous people have to the land that an organization is now on. And so in recognizing the Indigenous people, we're not just bringing visibility to the history. We are also calling in to existence, or we should be calling into existence, relationship building and nation building between maybe an organization or an institution, and building that relationship with the existing Indigenous people there. So why do we even recognize land? land acknowledgements are a type of traditional protocol. They existed in Native society before institutions figured out that they should be doing this. For example, when we travel out to other homelands of different people, whether we go to Arizona and we visit with Navajo people, or we travel to Minnesota and, or excuse me, to Michigan and visit with Potawatomi people, we enter into that land as Native people from our homelands, and we give thanks to the ancestors of that place, but we always try to find the Indigenous people to thank them for their hospitality, and we bring them gifts and we announce who we are because we are guests in their space. We go into a space and we announce to the ancestors who we are because we are guests in that space. And when people visit us, when Indigenous people visit us, they do the same. And so this is a international, it crosses Indigenous borders type of protocol. And so these recognize our longstanding histories between our nations, but in modern days, land acknowledgements recognize the longstanding and complex histories between Indigenous people and everybody else who arrived to the shores of North America. Land acknowledgements in a modern framework are meant to acknowledge colonialism and also acknowledge that colonialism is, as a concept, is still ongoing. It's not something that just happened between 1620 and 1776, right? It did not, colonialism did not go away with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We are still under a lot of colonial mindsets. A lot of extractive colonial mindsets and a lot of settler colonial mindsets. And those are two different things that I don't have time to get into today, but you can look up both extractive and settler colonialism because an example of settler colonialism is concepts of private property where Indigenous people were removed from the land and being the original stewards of the land and replaced, and then are not given any access to private property to do what it is that we have been doing for thousands of years. And so,
not even necessarily taking tribal nation input on waterways or land efforts to even encourage or bring back to healthy populations these species of concern that were protected and lived with and utilized by Indigenous people for thousands of years. So not noticing or caring about or forming a connection to people who have maintained a knowledge-based understanding of these things for a very long time and already had a balance to how they were doing things. Another example would be the use of language that is never given credit back to the Indigenous population from which it came. So the use of the word moose or squash, or the extraction of knowledge for the pharmaceutical companies, which produce 65% of their pharmaceuticals off of Indigenous teachings, and that knowledge is never given credit.
mm-hmm. So when we acknowledge land, we are not just acknowledging the lands and the waterways and maybe the animals in the waterways themselves. We are acknowledging all of the bodies of knowledge that have come from the land and that have come from the Indigenous people of the land. And it calls into mind that responsibility that we all have to care for the land and to be stewards of the land. So land acknowledgements are standing commitments to further action. You can have a land acknowledgement that basically, and we might see one here in this PowerPoint, that basically says, oh, such and such people were here. And that is the absolute bare minimum. And at the end of the day, it's not an acceptable type of land acknowledgement. What a land acknowledgement does is it provides a learning opportunity for people who have maybe never been exposed to Native history, Native people, who the tribal nations are in the area. But furthermore, what it does is it calls into action different types of things that we can do collectively to build bridges with Indigenous people and to promote healing. And it's a step towards decolonization. A lot of organizations and people want to, quote unquote, decolonize. And this is also a very snappy word, but and it is a process. It's not something that can, decolonization is not a metaphor, is an excellent read. But these land acknowledgements give moments for deep and personal reflection for the people who are reading the land acknowledgement and help them to understand how they have come to a specific place. So there are four main tenets of land acknowledgements, and it's responsibility, respect, reciprocity, and relationships. The responsibility that you have as a modern day person whose ancestors have come to this land in some sort of fashion, whether it's through immigration, whether it's through colonization, whether it's through enslavement. But unless your ancestors are from here, you have this responsibility to the people in the place that you're living in and the place that you're inhabiting. And it's your responsibility to go forth and learn about that history. It's also your responsibility to have respect for the people of that place, for the history of that place, however complicated it may be. It's important that, and respect is a concept that we have in our traditional teachings. It's one of many, but it is definitely a cornerstone. And so it's respecting other humans, but respecting the beings in creation and not looking at yourself as being over those beings in creation. It's not a top-down structure for us. Everything is our relative. The trees outside are our relatives, the animals, the stones on the ground, the water, it's part of us. And they are, for us, they are our older brother and sisters. And so we give them respect and we show them that through when we go out and we harvest and we offer something. And this ties into reciprocity. So we have reciprocal relationships with the land. And so this is something that land acknowledgements should do. They should have reciprocity with the land, and they should have reciprocity with the people that they that are stewarding, or excuse me, they should have. You should have reciprocal relationships with the Indigenous people who were once the stewards and caretakers of the land. And now you may be those stewards and caretakers, but it's important to build those relationships. So these slides just kind of go beyond a little bit what I said, and I can share these slides with folks. But ultimately, at the end of the day, land acknowledgements help Indigenous people speak for themselves, especially if you work in conjunction with Indigenous people. You know, land acknowledgements, though, they don't necessarily have to be organizational. They can be personal statements. They can be personal commitments. You know, you may be a person here in our audience who may say, well, I'm not really part of a bigger organization. I'm not on a board of any sort, or, you know, maybe I just volunteer here or there, or maybe I'm just living my life and I came here to learn about more. And why is she speaking about land acknowledgements? But land acknowledgements are something that you can do on an individual level. They are commitments that you can have on an individual level to build relationships with your Indigenous neighbors, to help us to be an ally and to help us to maintain our traditions in a time where things are, it's difficult to.
In a lot of ways, the responsibility, respect, reciprocity, and relationship, it's tiered in that fashion because those those tenets are how you get to a point where you understand your place in the space that you live and around the people that you live and the environment that you live in. And once you have an understanding and that relationship, that awareness, and that ideally this admiration and level of respect and love for the place, for the space that you're living in and the people around it and the deep culture that is part of that space, then you are able to carry that forth in how you carry yourself no matter where you go. So if you travel to another country, to another place, even if you travel to your homelands, let's say you come from Ireland and you go and visit your homeland, it has a deeper, richer meaning for you because you now have gained an ability to walk in that space in a better way and understand a deep meaning of connection.
Absolutely. These land acknowledgements are ways in which we can give back. You know, even for us as Native people, when we go and we have these personal land acknowledgements that we do, even if we're not acting on behalf of our tribal nations, if we're just going and traveling, you know, we are going and traveling, and we're going to give back to that land, into those original people. We always can find a way, and you can always find a way as well. So with that, I am going to say Katapatanemu, and I am also going to, I believe, open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Leah. We really appreciate that. So if anyone has questions, you can ask them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And then we do have someone here that raised their hand. Where did it go? Oh, maybe they unraised their hand. Oh, there it is.
No, there's another sign on the end one.
All right.
Okay, go ahead. I see your hand is raised.
Thank you so very, very much. We are so grateful for your wisdom. My name is Bracha, and we've been doing a land acknowledgement in our chat as we are having Zoom religious services across many, we're in the Washington, D.C. area, but we acknowledge some Indigenous folks from Maryland and D.C. and Virginia. So now we're at a point where we want to do more. So that's why we need the voices of some of our local Indigenous folks to guide us, because we wouldn't want to speak, you know, because we have a different background. And frankly, another thing we were thinking of, but I'd like to get your reaction to, is taking some strands from our tradition that seem to be parallel or aligned with North American Indigenous people, and trying to have that as a way for more people to come into that thinking. Do you know what I'm asking? Am I being clear?
I think I'm getting there. You see that there are parallels and similarities between some of our cultural practices and some of what you practice. So what I'm hearing is that you would like to kind of meld some of these together in an acknowledgement.
Yes, besides the basic acknowledgement that we've been doing with the names of the local people here, we wanted to add to that some of the traditions that we have in our, you know, books of wisdom about respect for trees, do not waste. There's a whole lot of things related to, in a general, say, environmental, even though my people has been pushed around the world a lot, so we don't have one place. But we have our books, and in our books we have some wisdom, and we'd like to make it obvious to our congregation. And so I guess we're looking for more guidance from Indigenous people about whether that would be okay.
Sure. So I think my suggestion to that would be looking into local Indigenous people who are from that homeland that you're living in. I'm not as familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, but there are maps, there are, Jonathan and I, we tend to steer people in the direction of federal and state recognized tribes, just because it's, there's more, there are deeper is not a good word. There are relationships that already exist oftentimes between federal, state recognized tribes and either local organizations, congregations, and of course governments. And so looking in those directions and finding who's there. I know Washington, D.C. is also filled with many different Native people who have come from across the country. I would suggest looking into finding a speaker who can come and speak to your congregation. And essentially having conversations with them ahead of time, building a little bit of relationship with them ahead of time, offering them financial support for them to come and speak, whether it's in person or on Zoom, whatever they're comfortable with. And they can probably also work with you to find those through lines between two different cultures, because ultimately around the world, people are connected to their homelands, people are connected to space, people are connected to the trees and to the different beings in creation. What has really separated us from those concepts are capitalism and imperialism. But as humans, we all need these beings around us to live and to thrive. And so, I'm not surprised that you're finding those commonalities. It's just in the past 400 years, especially, all of us collectively, as Americans or as Westerners, have been removed from those practices. And so I would really suggest looking into finding someone who can come speak in a very similar fashion that Jonathan and I came to speak, but try to find someone from those nations in your region.
Yeah, definitely. I would encourage you to develop that relationship, because that is part of the process. You can't really do land acknowledgement, you can't really do space acknowledgement without relationships with a lot of different parts of what makes that space unique and important, and that includes the Indigenous population from there or the closest thing to. And one thing to bear in mind too is that it's not one size fits all with Indigenous societies anywhere on the globe, but certainly not on Turtle Island across North, Central, and South America. There are so many different tribal nations with different protocols and different relationships and different words and different appropriate behaviors. It is absolutely necessary to have that respect for the people in that space, in that region, who are appropriate, knowledgeable, respected people who are recognized as that, as leaders amongst their people or knowledge keepers amongst their people. Not just anyone, but as Leah said, state or federally recognized tribal nations, and amongst them, the people who have the authority, the right to speak and to, and have actual knowledge to share, because not every Indigenous person is connected that well. That's part of the process that we're healing from today.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I just want everybody to know, I also put my email and Jonathan's email in the chat if you wanted to talk offline at another time. We did have a question come through the chat. It says, could you say more about the difference between extractive and settler colonialism? Yes. So the quick rundown. Extractive colonialism is something that happens, especially in the regions of India and Africa and Southeast Asia, where imperial powers of France, England, and the Netherlands, also the Spanish, went into those regions and extracted goods, extracted materials, extracted resources. Yes, they set up colonies, but they did not necessarily displace and replace the people. In settler colonialism, those same imperial groups came, and initially a lot of things were extractive, like you extract timber out of the region, for example. But in settler colonialism, what happens is there is a force of we settle, and then we replace the indigenous people of the land, and we continue to settle and we continue to replace. And so that's why while you walk down the street, you don't see a lot of indigenous people. That's why we make up less than 1% of the population. When there were over 500 million indigenous people prior to 1620, and at the time of European arrival here, there were 69 Wampanoag communities, and today, as a direct effect of settler colonialism, there are over 1 million Mayflower descendants and less than 6,000 Wampanoag people. So this is an example of how settler colonialism works. That is the quick rundown. There's a lot of scholarship on it. It's something that you can read about, something that you can look further on Google and Google Scholar. A lot of people write about it, but that's the quick rundown of the difference between the two. Other questions? That can be a heavy one, I know. I would definitely love to end on something more positive.
I have a lighter one, which is, hi, I'm Jillian. Do you have recommendations for media, either serious or sort of casual, that you feel do really good representation of Indigenous folks across the Americas?
Yeah, definitely. So I work at Brown University, and a colleague of mine, Adrian Keene, has a podcast with Matika Wilbur. It's called All My Relations. There are a bunch of different Indigenous podcasts. I am behind on the times, I think, with some podcasts, and people ask me all the time, who can I listen to? But I have to say, one of my favorite people to listen to is Robin Wall Kimmerer. You may have read the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is excellent. She also has another one, Gathering Moss. But search her in various podcast networks. And she doesn't have a podcast herself, but she is definitely a special guest on many of them. And I just love hearing her speak, watching different videos. There are many different TED Talks by Indigenous people.
There's Native America Calling, which has been around for a very long time. It's I've been interviewed numerous times for it, and many other Indigenous people across the country. There's also Red Hoop Talks through the Association on American Indian Affairs.
I think also, if you want something a little more extreme, but also highly recommended, the Red Nation podcast is on SoundCloud. That's also done by a colleague of ours. And that is dedicated to discussing colonialism. So that's hosted by Nick Estes, and he is a relative from out west.
There's some good programs on Aboriginal People's Television Network, which is a Canadian-based broadcast. Unfortunately, it's not technically available in the US, but you can go online and see some of their, some of their online presence. You can also follow them on Facebook and Instagram, and see some of their broadcasts. And there's different ways of sometimes accessing, like one person sets their sets themselves as based in Toronto just so that they can watch APTN because
We're
it's
not telling
available
you
out
to
of
do
Canada.
anything illegal. We're just
Yeah,
telling
we're
you
just
we know
saying
somebody who does something
There-
like that.
Yes, there's ways. Of
There are
doing
ways.
things.
We have not tried it though.
Of course, of course.
Yes, CBC, Canadian version of NPR, has great programs. Yes, that's true. And honestly, I'm optimistically cautious about YouTube, right? Because you know what a rabbit hole YouTube can be, but it also has really good resources as well, especially when there are programs that are posted on there that might be in conjunction with PBS and local media television. There's one, I can't think of the name of it, but they went all around the Great Lakes and talked to Potawatomi and Ojibwe folks. I mean, honestly, I tell people, start looking at federal tribal nation websites, and sometimes there's an education page, there's a cultural page, there's a learn more here page, and then you can start grabbing some of the language off of those sites to do and inform your YouTube or Google searches as well.
There's also newspaper, web-based newspapers.
Indian Country Today,
Yeah.
as well.
Turtle Talk.
Is Turtle Talk still
I
around?
think it is, yeah, and also Native
News Online.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a few of those. You can kind of search them out, and if you just want to see, unfortunately, where Native folks oftentimes are left out of the news in a lot of ways. It usually has to be something really controversial, really well covered in general and kind of too large to ignore for us to make the news for whatever reason. I mean, I think it has to do with just kind of the again, the sort of result of colonization and kind of the on paper and in the media erasure. Right, because I think ultimately people would be much more receptive to Native people, have a much greater relationship with Native people if there was access, if there was visibility, and if there was concern by the greater population of the country about Native people's well-being.
Yes. Karen B just sent in the chat, and I just sent it to everybody else, that Robin Wall Kimmer spoke at the Monadnock Lyceum in Peterborough, which is fascinating. So I'm not sure if that was recorded, but thank you for sending that along. So I think we have time to take one last question, and then we have to get back to our 5-year-olds. And if you'd like to, again, chat offline, our emails are in the chat, and Chris Jacobs has our contact information. Okay, go ahead, Lisa. Is it Lisa or Liza? Oh, you have to unmute. Asked to unmute. Okay. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay,
Yes.
cool. So my question concerns the land acknowledgements that I am now sort of hearing that feel very performative. It's like, I'm a cool and groovy person, and I'm going to say that I'm, from whatever lands, and however they frame it. And I guess my question to you is it better than nothing? And if it's not, how to sort of encourage people to do the next step?
Mhm.
Because, I think a lot of people, there's a part of them that wants to do what's right, and they're not going to do a deep dive into relationship building with the local community. They're just not. So what are the intermediary things that you think are appropriate or good, or you would like to see happen?
Excellent question. This is something that is discussed a lot. There are many performative land acknowledgements, as you stated. I pulled one up. I will read it to you. I have redacted specific information. But I will show you the difference. I'll read 2 land acknowledgements and I'll show you the difference between them. Founded in blank year, the organization name stands on the historic homelands of the blank and the blank people. That is a great example of a very performative land acknowledgement. It centers the organization first, and then it just basically says the organization sits here. What it's missing is a lot. It's missing actionable items. I think the most important thing that you can say after you hear or read or see a land acknowledgement is say, well, what are the actionable items that this organization is taking in order to build relationships with Indigenous people? Because if there are no actionable items, if there's no putting your money where your mouth is, essentially, and it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It can be in-kind work. It can be giving land access. It can be, there are various ways to build relationships.
Absolutely. It can be bringing consultants in. It can be, creating space for an opportunity for Indigenous people to have a voice in various ways. Festivals, gatherings, artwork. Like it can be, it can be very simple or it can be quite complex. The other thing is, in that land acknowledgement, it's historic based. The historic lands of. So it's relegating the Indigenous population to the past. They formerly lived here when they were alive back then. Kind of a mindset, as opposed to these are continual connections. Ancestors are still in that space, and Native people still view that space as their homeland, even if they don't have access to it at this time. It is still the heart of the nation. It is the heart of the people. And ultimately 300 or 400 years of change is minuscule in the fact that it's probably 10 or 15 or 20,000 years of continuous life in that space prior. So it's not easily washed away.
Absolutely. A land acknowledgement has a good anatomy structure to it. It acknowledges the nation and related communities first. It acknowledges sovereignty and autonomy. It acknowledges their ongoing relationships to the land. It acknowledges the land and the waters and the beings in creation. And a good land acknowledgement also has a statement and of gratitude and thanks to those original people. And it's followed with actions to empower. Today, we commit to blank by supporting A, B, and C. And
would you be able to provide us with an ideal land acknowledgement?
That is a big question. I have one that is okay. I still have my critiques about it. But I do.
It's guaranteed to be better than what everyone is doing currently.
Okay, I have one written here. I did not write it. And also keep in mind that a land acknowledgement is not a process. It can't be written in a weekend or in a couple of weeks or in a month. It is it should be an ongoing process with Indigenous consultants at the table with you, working with you. So the blank organization recognizes that it sits on the unceded ancestral homelands of the blank tribal nation. We extend our respect and gratitude towards the tribal nation who have lived here for millennia. They continue to care for and maintain connections to these ancestral homelands, and we uphold these by blank, blank, and blank. That would be a much better land acknowledgement than the first one I read you.
And it still has room for improvement, but I think one of the important things to remember is when you make when you go through the time and the commitment and the care to build an appropriate land acknowledgement, ideally, as Leah said, with the relationship of Indigenous people, with respect, with reciprocity, and recognition, you go through that process, but it doesn't end there. You constantly try to improve upon it. So it's that's that relationship piece that, relationships take work, and they're ongoing and they're evolving. And so ideally, a land acknowledgement and an organization or an individual's effort to move forward in a positive direction with respect to Indigenous people, wherever it's seated, wherever you're living, ideally will be a continuous thing that will ever evolve.
My personal view is that land acknowledgements must be a part of a strategic planning process. You put as much effort into them as you do your mission, your vision, and your values. And it's not something that, you just decide on very quickly. If you're deciding on your mission, vision, and values in one board meeting and you just go from there, and you call that your strategic plan, your organization is going to be in a lot of trouble. So I think folding in a land acknowledgement as part of a 3 to 5 year strategic plan and revisiting that land acknowledgement every 3 to 5 years is a very smart practice. And of course, this is for organizations, personally, for a land acknowledgement, if it's something you want to commit to as part of your mindfulness practice, as part of your daily practice, where part of your day you may consider as your quiet sacred time to meditate or to pray or to give thanks in whatever way, you can incorporate it. And just as those thoughts and those prayers, they're fluid, your land acknowledgement as personally can be that way too.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jonathan and Leah. We really appreciate these last 3 months, the amazing presentations and programs that you have brought to us here at Pinewoods and across the country and even across the world. I see someone from Australia has joined us tonight, so that's great to see them on here as well. We hope to continue seeing you at Pinewoods in some form in the coming years, Jonathan and Leah. So thank you again for all your time and your knowledge and for sharing that with us. If you, the viewer, would like to make a donation, Anna is going to put a link in the chat. Those donations help bring programs like this. It's been really great to have Zoom to be able to do this. So it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And we're actually continuing on with our inclusion and diversity. And next month in April, we actually are doing a program. It's called Getting More Comfortable with Gender. And it's scheduled for Tuesday, April 12th. From starting at 7 o'clock. That's with Kat Dutton. Many of you may know them from the Scottish sessions. So Kat will be presenting that program, and we're looking forward to that. And so we can also, so again, these past 3 programs, they've been recorded, and we will be working to get those up and running online, and hopefully those will be sent out in our April articles and announcements. Anything else, Jonathan and Leah?
We just want to say Katapatanamu. Thank you all for joining us and sticking around. It was great listening to your questions, and we're always happy to speak to our friends at the Pinewoods.
Absolutely. And thank you for spending the evening with us. We hope we were insightful, helpful,
Entertaining.
Entertaining sometimes, certainly. But we hope you enjoyed yourselves with us, and we look forward to participating in future endeavors But we are always available, and certainly feel free to follow us. We do quite a bit out in representing our tribal nations and educating the public and working with the tribal youth. So we're pretty active. There's,
You can follow us on Instagram if you're on
Yeah.
Instagram at We Face East.
Awesome. Great.